the fractured foundation. The aroma of freshly baked cookies wafted through the Morrison household, a scent that would typically herald warmth and comfort. But on this crisp autumn afternoon, it only served to underscore the tension simmering beneath the surface of their seemingly picture-perfect suburban home. Sarah Morrison stood in the kitchen, her blonde hair pulled back in a messy bun, flour dusting her cheeks as she removed another batch of chocolate chip cookies from the oven. She glanced at the clock. 3:45 p.m. Eric would be home from soccer practice soon, and with his arrival she knew the fragile peace of the afternoon would shatter. As if on cue, the front door slammed, causing Sarah to flinch. Heavy footsteps thundered up the stairs, followed by another door slamming shut. Sarah closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and tried to quell the anxiety rising in her chest. "Mummy, is Eric home?" A small voice piped up from the living room. Sarah turned to see her 5-year-old daughter, Lily, peering around the doorframe, her big blue eyes wide with curiosity and a touch of apprehension. "Yes, sweetheart," Sarah replied, forcing a smile. "But let's give him some time to settle in, okay? Why don't you come help me decorate these cookies?" Lily's face lit up, and she scampered into the kitchen, climbing onto a stool by the counter. As Sarah helped her daughter press colorful sprinkles into the warm cookies, she couldn't help but reflect on how different things were just 2 years ago. Back then, she had been a single mother, struggling to balance her career as an interior designer with raising Lily. Meeting James had felt like a miracle. He was kind, successful, and Lily adored him. Their whirlwind romance had culminated in a beautiful wedding just 8 months ago. Sarah had truly believed that she had found her happily ever after. But she hadn't accounted for Eric. James's son from his first marriage had been living with his mother in another state when Sarah and James first got together. Eric had visited occasionally, and while he had been reserved, Sarah hadn't sensed any outright hostility. But when Eric's mother unexpectedly took a job overseas 3 months ago, Eric had come to live with them full-time. And that's when everything changed. The sound of a door opening upstairs pulled Sarah from her reverie. Eric's footsteps echoed as he descended the stairs, and Sarah steeled herself for the inevitable confrontation. Eric appeared in the kitchen doorway, his 6-foot frame filling the space. At 17, he was the spitting image of his father, same dark hair, same intense brown eyes. But where James' eyes held warmth and laughter, Eric's were cold and accusatory as they locked onto Sarah. "Eric!" Lily cried out joyfully, jumping down from her stool and running to hug her stepbrother. For a moment, Eric's face softened as he returned Lily's embrace. "Hey, Squirt," he said, ruffling her hair. "How was school?" As Lily launched into an animated retelling of her day, Sarah watched the interaction with a mixture of hope and trepidation. Eric was always gentle with Lily, and in those moments, Sarah could see glimpses of the kind-hearted boy James always described. But as soon as Lily finished her story and skipped back to her cookies, the walls came back up. Eric's expression hardened as he turned to Sarah. "Where's Dad?" he asked, his tone clipped. "He called earlier," Sarah replied, trying to keep her voice neutral. "He's running late at the office, but should be home for dinner." Eric scoffed. "Of course he is." Sarah felt her patience wearing thin. "Eric, I know you're disappointed, but your father works hard to provide for this family. A little gratitude wouldn't hurt." "Gratitude?" Eric's voice rose. "For what?" "For uprooting my entire life. For forcing me to live in this fake, plastic world with you." "Eric," Sarah gasped, glancing worriedly at Lily, who had stopped decorating and was watching them with wide, fearful eyes. "That's enough. Go to your room if you can't speak civilly." "Gladly," Eric spat. "Anything to get away from you." As Eric stormed back upstairs, Sarah felt tears pricking at her eyes. She turned away, not wanting Lily to see her cry. "Mummy," Lily's small voice quavered. "Why is Eric so angry all the time?" Sarah took a deep breath, composing herself before facing her daughter. "Sometimes, sweetheart, big changes can be really hard for people. Eric is still adjusting to living here with us. We just need to be patient and show him lots of love, okay? Lily nodded solemnly, but Sarah could see the confusion and worry in her young eyes. It broke her heart to see how the constant tension was affecting her daughter. The rest of the evening passed in a haze of homework, dinner preparation, and strained silence. James arrived home just as Sarah was setting the table, looking wary but managing a smile as he kissed her cheek. "How was your day, honey?" he asked, loosening his tie. Sarah hesitated, not wanting to burden him with yet another complaint about Eric. "It was fine," she said finally. "Dinner's almost ready. Could you call Eric down?" James nodded, heading to the stairs. Sarah heard his footsteps, followed by a knock and muffled voices. A few moments later, James returned alone, his expression troubled. "He says he's not hungry," James reported, running a hand through his hair. Sarah felt a flare of frustration. "James, you can't let him keep isolating himself like this. It's not healthy." I know, James sighed. "But pushing him will only make things worse. He just needs time." Time. Sarah's voice rose despite her efforts to stay calm. "It's been 3 months, James. How much more time does he need?" "Sarah, please," James pleaded, glancing towards the stairs. "Can we not do this now? Let's just have a nice family dinner." Sarah wanted to argue further, but Lily chose that moment to bounce into the dining room, chattering excitedly about her day at school. So Sarah swallowed her frustration and pasted on a smile, determined to give her daughter at least the illusion of a happy family meal. As they ate, Sarah couldn't help but stare at the empty 4th chair at the table. It stood as a glaring reminder of the divide in their household, of the stepson who refused to accept her, of the family she had imagined that seemed to be slipping further and further from her grasp. Later that night, after Lily was tucked into bed, Sarah found herself alone in the master bedroom, folding laundry with more force than necessary. James entered, looking exhausted. "Eric asleep?" Sarah asked, not looking up from her task. "I think so," James replied, sitting heavily on the edge of the bed. "Sarah, we need to talk about this." Sarah's hands stilled on the shirt she was folding. "About what, James?" "About how your son hates me. About how he's making Lily miserable. About how our entire family is being torn apart." "He doesn't hate you," James said, but his tone lacked conviction. "He's just struggling. Losing his mom, moving to a new city, starting a new school. It's a lot for a teenager to handle." "I understand that," Sarah said, fighting to keep her voice level. "But it's been months, James. He refuses to even try to be part of this family. He's rude, he's disrespectful, and I'm at my wit's end." James stood, moving to wrap his arms around Sarah, but she stepped away. "I'm trying, Sarah. I don't know what else to do. I can't force him to accept this situation overnight." "And what about me?" Sarah's voice cracked. "What about Lily? How long are we supposed to live like this? Walking on eggshells in our own home?" "I don't know," James admitted, his shoulders slumping. "But he's my son, Sarah. I can't give up on him." The unspoken implication hung heavy in the air between them. "But you could give up on us." Sarah turned away, blinking back tears. "I'm going to check on Lily," she murmured, fleeing the room before James could respond. In the hallway, Sarah paused outside Eric's door. No light shone from beneath it, but she could hear the faint sound of music playing. For a moment, she considered knocking, trying one more time to bridge the chasm between them. But the memory of his harsh words earlier stopped her. With a heavy sigh, she continued to Lily's room. Lily was fast asleep, her blonde curls spread across the pillow, her favorite stuffed unicorn clutched tightly to her chest. Sarah sat gently on the edge of the bed, smoothing a hand over her daughter's hair. "Oh, Lily," she whispered, "I'm so sorry. You deserve better than this." As if sensing her mother's distress, Lily stirred slightly in her sleep, her small hand reaching out. Sarah took it, marveling at how tiny and fragile it felt in her own. In that moment, looking at her sleeping child, Sarah made a decision. Things couldn't continue as they were. Something had to change, for Lily's sake if nothing else. She couldn't keep subjecting her daughter to this toxic environment. With a heavy heart, Sarah realized what she had to do. It would be painful, it would be difficult, but she saw no other way forward. Tomorrow, she would talk to James about sending Eric to live with his grandparents. As Sarah kissed Lily's forehead and quietly left the room, she felt a mix of guilt and resolve. She knew James would be upset, knew it might drive a wedge between them. But she had to protect her daughter, had to salvage what was left of their family before it was too late. Tomorrow would bring confrontation and heartache, but it would also bring a chance for a new beginning. Sarah only hoped that the bridges she was about to burn could someday be rebuilt. With one last glance at Eric's closed door, Sarah returned to the master bedroom, steeling herself for the difficult conversations that lay ahead. The future of their family hung in the balance, and Sarah was determined to fight for the happiness and stability she had always dreamed of, no matter the cost. Ripples of regret. The Morrison house stood silent in the pale light of dawn, its inhabitants restless with the weight of unspoken words and impending change. Sarah hadn't slept, her mind racing with the conversation she knew she had to have with James. As the first rays of sunlight crept through the curtains, she steeled herself for the day ahead. James stirred beside her, reaching out instinctively. Sarah allowed herself a moment of comfort in his embrace before the reality of their situation came crushing back. "James," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "We need to talk." James opened his eyes, immediately alert at the seriousness in Sarah's tone. "What is it?" Sarah sat up, hugging her knees to her chest. "It's about Eric. I think we need to consider other options." James furrowed his brow, sitting up as well. "What do you mean, other options?" Taking a deep breath, Sarah forged ahead. "I think it might be best if Eric went to live with your parents for a while." The silence that followed was deafening. James stared at her, disbelief etched across his features. "You want to send my son away?" "James, please," Sarah pleaded. "Just hear me out. Things can't go on like this. The constant tension, the arguments, it's tearing us apart. And it's affecting Lily. She's scared and confused, and it's not fair to her." James spun his legs over the side of the bed, his back to Sarah. "So your solution is to ship Eric off? He's my son, Sarah. I can't just abandon him." "It's not abandonment," Sarah argued, her voice rising slightly before she caught herself and lowered it again, mindful of the sleeping children down the hall. It's a chance for everyone to heal. Your parents adore Eric, and maybe some time away from all this tension will help him sort through his feelings." James stood, pacing the room. "And what about my feelings? Did you consider those at all?" Sarah felt tears pricking at her eyes. "Of course I did. James, this isn't easy for me either. But we have to think about what's best for everyone, including Eric. He's miserable here, and he's making everyone else miserable too." Before James could respond, a small voice came from the doorway. "Daddy? Mummy? Why are you fighting?" They turned to see Lily standing there, clutching her stuffed unicorn, her eyes wide with fear. James immediately went to her, scooping her up in his arms. "We're not fighting, Princess," he soothed, though his eyes told a different story as they met Sarah's over Lily's head. "Mummy and I were just having a grown-up talk." Sarah joined them, running a hand over Lily's hair. "Everything's okay, sweetie. Why don't we go make some breakfast?" As Sarah led Lily downstairs, James remained in the bedroom, his mind reeling. The idea of sending Eric away felt like a betrayal, and yet, hadn't he noticed the strain on Lily? The growing distance between himself and Sarah? The way Eric seemed to retreat further into himself with each passing day. Downstairs, the kitchen came to life with the sounds and smells of breakfast. Sarah moved on autopilot, flipping pancakes and scrambling eggs, her mind still upstairs with James. Lily chattered away, seemingly oblivious to the tension, but Sarah noticed how her daughter's eyes kept darting to the stairs, waiting for the rest of the family to appear. Eric was the next to come down, drawn by the smell of food. He paused in the doorway, his eyes meeting Sarah's for a brief, tense moment before he mumbled a grudging morning and took his seat at the table. Sarah placed a plate in front of him, trying once more to bridge the gap. "I made your favorite, chocolate chip pancakes." Eric stared at the plate for a long moment before muttering, "I'm not hungry," and pushing it away. Sarah felt her heart sink. Even this small gesture of peace was rejected. She turned back to the stove, blinking rapidly to hold back tears. James entered the kitchen last, his face a mask of forced cheerfulness. "Something smells great." Breakfast proceeded in a strained silence, broken only by Lily's occasional comments and James' overly enthusiastic responses. Sarah and Eric avoided each other's gazes, while James' eyes darted between them, a storm of indecision brewing behind his smile. As soon as he finished eating, Eric stood abruptly. "I'm going to be late for school," he announced, grabbing his backpack. "But it's Saturday," Lily pointed out, confusion evident in her voice. Eric froze for a moment, caught in the lie. I have a study group," he mumbled before fleeing the house, the door slamming behind him. The sound seemed to echo through the house, a physical manifestation of the fractures in their family. Lily's lower lip trembled, and she looked to her parents with pleading eyes. "Why is Eric always so angry?" she asked, her voice small and hurt. Sarah and James exchanged a look over their daughter's head. In that moment, the weight of their decision pressed down on them both. "Lily, sweetheart," Sarah began gently, "sometimes big changes can be really hard for people. Eric is still trying to adjust to living here with us." "But it's been forever," Lily protested. "Doesn't he like us?" James stepped in, his voice rough with emotion. "Of course he likes you, princess. Eric is he's going through a tough time right now. But we're going to figure it out, okay?" Lily nodded, but the worry didn't leave her eyes. Sarah felt a fresh wave of guilt wash over her. This was exactly why she had suggested sending Eric to his grandparents, to spare Lily from this constant state of anxiety and confusion. After breakfast, James retreated to his home office, ostensibly to catch up on work, but Sarah knew he was avoiding the conversation they needed to have. She busied herself with household chores, her mind racing as she tried to figure out how to broach the subject again. It was mid-afternoon when James finally emerged, his face lined with worry and fatigue. He found Sarah in the living room, folding laundry with mechanical precision. "Where's Lily?" he asked, glancing around. "At a playdate with Emma next door," Sarah replied, not looking up from her task. I thought we could use some time to talk." James nodded, sinking into an armchair. For a long moment, neither of them spoke, the only sound the soft rustle of clothes as Sarah continued folding. Finally, James broke the silence. "I called my parents." Sarah's hands stilled on the shirt she was folding. She looked up, meeting James's gaze. "And they said," James paused, swallowing hard. "They said they'd be happy to have Eric stay with them for a while, if that's what we decide." The words hung heavy in the air between them. Sarah set aside the laundry, moving to sit on the arm of James's chair. She placed a hand on his shoulder, feeling the tension there. "James, I know this is hard, but I really think it might be for the best, just for a little while, until we can all figure things out." James leaned into her touch, his voice barely above a whisper. What kind of father sends his son away? "A father who's trying to do what's best for his entire family," Sarah answered gently, "including Eric. He's hurting, James. Maybe some time away, some space to process everything, will help him heal." James was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke again, his voice was thick with unshed tears. "What if he thinks I'm abandoning him? What if this just makes things worse?" Sarah felt her own eyes welling up. "We won't let that happen. We'll make sure he knows this isn't permanent, that we're not giving up on him. We'll visit, call every day, and we'll use this time to work on ourselves, to figure out how to be the family Eric needs when he comes back." James nodded slowly, the fight seeming to drain out of him. "How did we get here, Sarah?" How did everything fall apart so quickly? Sarah slid from the arm of the chair into James's lap, wrapping her arms around him. It didn't fall apart, love. It's just bent, but we're going to fix it. Together. As they held each other, both lost in thought, neither noticed the front door opening quietly. Eric stood in the entryway, having returned from his study group, his face a mask of shock and betrayal as he overheard their conversation. Before either Sarah or James could register his presence, Eric was gone, the door closing behind him with a soft click that seemed to echo with finality. Sarah and James sprang apart, rushing to the door, but Eric was already halfway down the street, his figure receding in the distance. "Eric," James called out, his voice breaking, but his son didn't turn back. As they watched Eric disappear around the corner, Sarah and James stood in the doorway, the weight of their decision pressing down on them. The ripples of their choice were already spreading, threatening to become a tidal wave that could wash away the very foundations of their family. In that moment, as the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across their front yard, Sarah and James faced the daunting reality of the path ahead. They had made their decision with the best of intentions, hoping to heal the fractures in their family. But as they stood there, watching the empty street where their son had vanished, they couldn't shake the feeling that they might have just made the biggest mistake of their lives. The journey to rebuild their family had begun, but the road ahead was fraught with uncertainty. As Sarah leaned into James, seeking comfort in his embrace, she silently prayed that the bridges they were trying to build would be strong enough to withstand the storms that were surely coming. Bridges burned. The soft glow of streetlights flickered to life as dusk settled over the neighborhood. Sarah paced the living room, her phone clutched tightly in her hand, while James stood by the window, his eyes scanning the darkening street for any sign of Eric. "Still nothing?" Sarah asked, her voice tight with worry. James shook his head, running a hand through his hair. "No, I've tried calling and texting. It all goes straight to voicemail." The front door opened, and both Sarah and James whirled around, hope flaring in their eyes. But it was only Lily, returned from her playdate, Emma's mother standing behind her with a concerned expression. "Is everything okay?" Emma's mom asked, taking in James and Sarah's tense postures. "Yes, everything's fine," Sarah lied smoothly, forcing a smile. "Thank you so much for having Lily over." As soon as the door closed, Lily looked up at her parents, her big blue eyes filled with worry. "Where's Eric?" Sarah and James exchanged a pained glance. How could they explain to their 5-year-old that her stepbrother had run away after overhearing their plans to send him to his grandparents? James knelt down to Lily's level. Eric needed some time to himself, sweetheart, but he'll be back soon." Lily's lower lip trembled. "Is it because of me? Did I make him mad?" "Oh, no, baby," Sarah rushed to reassure her, pulling Lily into a tight hug. "This has nothing to do with you. Eric loves you very much." As Sarah comforted Lily, James stepped out onto the front porch, dialing Eric's number once again. This time, instead of going to voicemail, it rang twice before Eric picked up. "Eric, thank God. Where are you? Are you okay?" James's words tumbled out in a rush of relief and concern. There was a long pause before Eric's voice came through, cold and distant. "I'm fine. I'm at Jake's house." James closed his eyes, relief washing over him. Jake was Eric's best friend from the soccer team. At least he was somewhere safe. "Eric, please come home. We need to talk about this." "Talk about what?" Eric's voice dripped with sarcasm. "About how you're shipping me off to Grandma and Grandpa's. How you're choosing your new family over me." "That's not what's happening, Eric," James pleaded. "We're just trying to figure out what's best for everyone, including you." "Save it," Eric snapped. "I'll be home later. Don't wait up." The line went dead. James stood on the porch for a long moment, staring at his phone. How had things gone so wrong? He thought back to just a year ago, when he and Sarah had gotten married. He had been so full of hope, so certain that they could build a happy blended family. Now it felt like everything was crumbling around him. Inside, Sarah had managed to get Lily settled with a movie. She joined James on the porch, wrapping her arms around herself against the chill of the evening air. "Was that Eric?" she asked softly. James nodded, his expression grim. "He's at Jake's house. He's pretty angry." Sarah's shoulders slumped. "He heard us talking, didn't he? About sending him to your parents?" "Yeah," James confirmed, his voice rough. "Sarah, I don't know if we can do this. Maybe we're making a huge mistake." Sarah was quiet for a long moment, her gaze fixed on the darkened street. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "I don't know either, James, but I do know we can't go on like this. Something has to change." As they stood there, the weight of their decision pressing down on them, neither noticed the curtain twitching in the living room window. Lily peered out, her young face creased with worry as she watched her parents' hushed conversation. The next morning dawned grey and drizzly, matching the somber mood that had settled over the Morrison household. Eric had slipped in late the night before, ignoring James and Sarah's attempts to talk as he barricaded himself in his room. At the breakfast table, the tension was palpable. Lily pushed her cereal around her bowl, her usual chatter noticeably absent. Sarah busied herself at the sink, scrubbing dishes that were already clean, while James stared into his coffee cup as if it held the answers to all their problems. The silence was broken by the sound of Eric's bedroom door opening. He appeared in the kitchen doorway, his duffel bag slung over his shoulder. "Eric," James started, rising from his chair. "Son, please, can we talk about this?" Eric's gaze was cold as he surveyed the kitchen, lingering for a moment on Lily's worried face before settling on his father. "There's nothing to talk about. I called Grandma and Grandpa. They're coming to pick me up this afternoon." Sarah whirled around from the sink, her eyes wide. "Eric, no, that's not what way." "Save it." Eric cut her off. "This is what you wanted, isn't it? Me out of your perfect little family." "That's not fair, Eric," James said, his voice strained. "We're just trying to." "To what?" Eric interrupted, his voice rising. "To get rid of me? To pretend I don't exist so you can play happy families with your new wife and kid?" "Eric," Sarah gasped, glancing worriedly at Lily, who had shrunk back in her chair, her eyes filling with tears. But Eric was beyond caring. Months of pent-up anger and hurt came pouring out. "You know what? I'm glad I'm leaving. I'm sick of pretending. Sick of trying to fit into this fake, picture-perfect life you've created. You want me gone? Fine, I'm gone." With that, he turned on his heel and stormed out of the kitchen. The front door slammed a moment later, the sound echoing through the suddenly silent house. Lily burst into tears, and Sarah rushed to comfort her. James stood frozen for a moment before springing into action, grabbing his keys and heading for the door. "I'll go after him," he called over his shoulder. But by the time James made it outside, Eric was nowhere to be seen. He drove around the neighborhood for an hour, checking all of Eric's usual haunts, but his son had vanished. When James returned home, defeated, he found Sarah sitting on the couch, her head in her hands. Lily was curled up next to her, finally asleep after crying herself into exhaustion. "Any luck?" Sarah asked, looking up as James entered. He shook his head, sinking down into an armchair. "No, I tried calling, but his phone's off." They sat in heavy silence, the ticking of the clock on the mantel seeming to count down the seconds until Eric's grandparents would arrive to take him away. "James," Sarah said softly, her voice thick with unshed tears. "I'm so sorry. This is all my fault. If I hadn't suggested sending him away." James moved to sit beside her, pulling both Sarah and the sleeping Lily into his arms. "It's not your fault, Sarah. We both made this decision. We thought we were doing the right thing." As they held each other, both lost in their own thoughts, the weight of their choices pressed down on them. The bridges they had tried to build between their blended family now lay in ashes, and they were left to wonder if they could ever rebuild from the ruins. Hours ticked by, the atmosphere in the house growing heavier with each passing minute. James alternated between pacing and checking his phone, while Sarah busied herself with mundane tasks, unable to sit still. It was mid-afternoon when the doorbell finally rang. James and Sarah exchanged a look of mingled dread and resignation before James went to answer it. James's parents, Robert and Eleanor, stood on the porch, their faces etched with concern. "James," Eleanor said, pulling her son into a hug. "What's going on?" "Eric called us, but he didn't explain much." As James ushered them inside and began to explain the situation, Sarah hung back, a knot of guilt tightening in her stomach. She had always gotten along well with James's parents, but now she couldn't help but wonder if they blamed her for this mess. The explanation was interrupted by the sound of the back door opening and closing. Eric appeared in the living room, his eyes red-rimmed, but his jaw set in determination. "Eric," James breathed, relief evident in his voice. "Where have you been? We've been worried sick." Eric ignored him, turning instead to his grandparents. "Can we go now?" he asked, his voice flat. Eleanor looked between Eric and James, her brow furrowed with concern. "Eric, honey, are you sure this is what you want? Maybe if we all sat down and talked." "There's nothing to talk about," Eric cut her off. "I want to leave. Now." The finality in his tone seemed to suck the air out of the room. James made one last attempt, stepping towards his son with pleading eyes. "Eric, please, we can work this out. Just give us a chance." "A chance to what?" Eric exploded, all his pent-up anger bursting forth. "To pretend you still want me around. To act like we're one big happy family when it's obvious I don't belong here." "That's not true," Sarah interjected, her voice shaking. "Eric, we love you. We're just trying to." "To get rid of me," Eric finished for her, his voice cold. "Well, congratulations. You got what you wanted. I'm leaving." With that, he brushed past them all, heading for the front door. Robert and Eleanor exchanged a helpless look before following, leaving James and Sarah standing shell-shocked in the living room. As the sound of car doors slamming and an engine starting filtered through the open front door, James seemed to snap out of his daze. He rushed outside, calling Eric's name, but it was too late. The car was already pulling away, taking Eric with it. James stood in the driveway, watching the car disappear around the corner, the rain that had been threatening all day finally beginning to fall. Each drop felt like an accusation, a reminder of how badly they had failed. Inside, Sarah sank onto the couch, her body shaking with silent sobs. This was never what she had wanted. She had truly believed that giving Eric some space would help heal their fractured family. Instead, it felt like she had just destroyed it completely. A small hand on her arm made her look up. Lily stood there, her eyes wide and frightened. "Mummy, is Eric gone? Is he coming back?" Sarah pulled Lily into her arms, her heart breaking at the tremor in her daughter's voice. "Oh, sweetie, I don't know, I hope so." As James came back inside, dripping with rain and defeat, the three of them huddled together on the couch. The silence of the house seemed to echo with the absence of the son and Stepson who should have been there. In that moment, as the rain pattered against the windows and the last light of day faded, the Morrison family faced the daunting reality of the bridges they had burned. The path to reconciliation, if it existed at all, would be long and fraught with challenges. But as they clung to each other in the gathering darkness, they silently vowed to find a way to rebuild, no matter how impossible it seemed. The journey ahead would be difficult, the wounds deep and raw, but in the ashes of their mistakes, perhaps they could find the strength to forge new connections, to rebuild the bridges they had so carelessly destroyed. It would take time, patience, and more love than they thought possible. But for the sake of their family, all of their family, they had to try. As night fell over the Morrison house, the first tentative seeds of hope began to take root amidst the ruins of their shattered family. The road ahead was uncertain, but they would face it together, one step at a time. The turning point. The weeks following Eric's departure passed in a haze of regret and strained silence for the Morrison household. The empty chair at the dinner table seemed to mock them nightly, a stark reminder of their fractured family. James threw himself into his work, often returning home long after Sarah and Lily had gone to bed. Sarah, meanwhile, found herself obsessively cleaning and reorganizing, as if by putting their physical home in order, she could somehow mend the emotional chaos that had torn them apart. Lily, caught in the crossfire of adult decisions she couldn't fully understand, became withdrawn. Her usual bubbly personality dimmed, replaced by a quiet watchfulness that broke Sarah's heart. One evening, as Sarah tucked her into bed, Lily's small voice pierced the silence. "Mummy, is it my fault Eric left?" Sarah felt as if she'd been punched in the gut. "Oh, sweetheart, no," she said, gathering Lily into her arms. "None of this is your fault, Eric. Eric is dealing with grown-up problems that have nothing to do with you." Lily sniffled against Sarah's shoulder. "But if I was a better sister, maybe he would have stayed." Sarah felt tears pricking at her own eyes. "Lily, listen to me. You are the best sister anyone could ask for. Eric loves you very much. He just needs some time to figure things out." As Lily finally drifted off to sleep, Sarah sat on the edge of the bed, her mind racing. How had they let things get so out of hand? The weight of guilt pressed down on her, suffocating in its intensity. Downstairs, she found James in his home office, poring over documents spread across his desk. He looked up as she entered, the dark circles under his eyes a testament to his own sleepless nights. "James," Sarah said softly, "we need to talk." He nodded, pushing away from his desk. "I know." They settled on the living room couch, the distance between them feeling both physical and emotional. For a long moment, neither spoke, the ticking of the clock on the mantel the only sound in the room. Finally, Sarah broke the silence. "I called a family therapist today." James looked up, surprise evident on his face. "You did?" Sarah nodded, twisting her wedding ring nervously. I think we need help, James. All of us, including Eric." She paused, taking a deep breath. "I know I'm the last person who should be suggesting this, considering I'm the one who wanted to send Eric away in the first place. But I can't bear to see our family falling apart like this." James was quiet for a long moment, and Sarah felt her heart racing, afraid she'd overstepped. But then he reached out, taking her hand in his. "You're right," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "We can't go on like this." As they sat there, hands clasped, a small spark of hope flickered to life. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The next few days were a flurry of activity. Sarah and James had their first session with Dr. Elaine Chen, the family therapist. It was painful and raw, laying bare the fears and insecurities that had led to their current situation. But as they left the office, both felt a sense of cautious optimism. "I think this could really help," James said as they drove home. But we need Eric," Sarah finished for him. "I know." They had tried calling Eric several times since he left, but each attempt was met with stony silence or a curt dismissal. James's parents reported that Eric was doing fine, attending school and keeping up with his soccer, but he steadfastly refused to discuss returning home. It was a week later when everything changed. Sarah was in the middle of making dinner when her phone rang. Her heart leaped when she saw it was James's mother, Eleanor. "Sarah?" Eleanor's voice was tight with worry. "Is James there?" "He's on his way home from work," Sarah replied, a knot of dread forming in her stomach. "Eleanor, what's wrong?" There was a pause, and Sarah could hear Eleanor taking a shaky breath. "It's Eric. He's in the hospital." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Sarah gripped the counter to steady herself. "What happened?" "There was an accident at soccer practice," Eleanor explained, her voice trembling. "He took a bad fall and hit his head. The doctors say he'll be okay, but..." Sarah didn't wait to hear more. "We're on our way," she said, already moving to grab her keys and Lily's jacket. The next few hours passed in a blur. Sarah called James, who met them at the hospital. Lily was left with a neighbor, despite her tearful protests. As they raced down the highway, Sarah's mind whirled with a mix of fear and desperate hope. This wasn't how she wanted to reunite with Eric, but maybe, just maybe, it could be the turning point they needed. When they arrived at the hospital, they found Robert and Eleanor in the waiting room. Eleanor rushed to embrace them both, her eyes red-rimmed from crying. "How is he?" James asked, his voice tight with worry. "The doctor just came out," Robert answered, his usual stoic demeanor cracking slightly. "He's got a concussion and some bruised ribs, but he's going to be okay. They're keeping him overnight for observation." Sarah felt her knees go weak with relief. James steadied her with an arm around her waist, and she leaned into him gratefully. "Can we see him?" she asked. Eleanor nodded. "He's still a bit groggy from the pain medication, but the doctor said short visits are fine." As they approached Eric's room, Sarah felt her heart racing. What if Eric didn't want to see them? What if this only made things worse? But when they entered the room, all her fears melted away. Eric lay in the hospital bed, looking smaller and more vulnerable than Sarah had ever seen him. His head was bandaged, and bruises were starting to bloom on his face. But his eyes, when he turned to look at them, Sarah saw a flicker of something she hadn't seen in months: hope. "Dad." Eric's voice was barely above a whisper. "Sarah?" James was at his side in an instant, gently taking Eric's hand. "We're here, son. We're right here." Sarah approached the bed more cautiously, her heart in her throat. "Eric, we've been so worried." For a long moment, Eric just looked at them, his eyes moving from James to Sarah and back again. Then, to Sarah's utter shock, he started to cry. "I'm sorry," he choked out between sobs. "I'm so sorry." James perched on the edge of the bed, carefully gathering Eric into his arms. "Sure, it's okay. You have nothing to be sorry for." Sarah moved to Eric's other side, her own tears falling freely now. She reached out, hesitating for just a moment before gently stroking Eric's hair. To her surprise and relief, he didn't pull away. "We're the ones who should be apologizing, Eric," she said softly. "We made so many mistakes, but we love you so much. And we want to make things right, if you'll let us." Eric looked up at her, his eyes red and swollen but clearer than they had been in months. "I've been so angry," he admitted. "At you, at Dad, at everyone. But when I was lying there on the field, all I could think was, I wanted to go home." The word home hung in the air between them, fragile and precious. Sarah felt a surge of hope so strong it nearly took her breath away. "Then come home," James said, his voice rough with emotion. "Come home, and we'll figure this out together. All of us." Eric nodded, wincing slightly at the movement. "Okay," he whispered. "Okay." As they sat there, the three of them connected in a way they hadn't been in far too long. Sarah felt the first real stirrings of healing begin. There was still so much to work through, so many conversations to be had and wounds to mend. But for the first time in months, it felt like they were on the right path. Later that night, as Eric slept and James dozed in the chair beside his bed, Sarah stepped out into the hallway to call and check on Lily. As she entered the call, assuring her daughter that Eric was okay and that they'd all be home soon, she leaned against the wall and closed her eyes. The last few months had been a nightmare of their own making. They had nearly destroyed their family in a misguided attempt to save it. But standing there in the quiet hospital corridor, Sarah felt a sense of peace settle over her. They had been given a second chance, an opportunity to rebuild what they had so carelessly torn down. It wouldn't be easy. There would be hard conversations, tears, and probably more than a few setbacks. But as Sarah looked through the window at James and Eric, she knew with absolute certainty that it would be worth it. This was their turning point, the moment when they stopped running from their problems and started facing them head-on. The moment when they remembered that family wasn't about perfection, but about love, forgiveness, and the willingness to keep trying even when things seemed hopeless. As the first light of dawn began to creep through the hospital windows, Sarah felt a renewed sense of determination. They would rebuild their family, stronger and more resilient than before. They would learn from their mistakes and grow together. And most importantly, they would never again forget the precious, fragile nature of the bonds that held them together. With a deep breath and a silent prayer of gratitude, Sarah turned and went back into Eric's room. As she settled into the chair on the other side of his bed, taking his hand in hers, she knew that this was just the beginning. The road ahead would be long and sometimes difficult, but they would walk it together, one step at a time. The bridges they had burned were gone, but from the ashes they would build new ones. Stronger, more flexible, and able to withstand whatever storms might come their way. This was their turning point, and Sarah was determined to make the most of it. As Eric stirred slightly in his sleep, Sarah squeezed his hand gently. "Welcome home," she whispered, and for the first time in months, she truly believed that everything would be okay. Rebuilding trust. The Morrison house stood quiet in the pale light of early morning, a stark contrast to the emotional turmoil of the past few days. Sarah stood at the kitchen window, cradling a mug of coffee, her eyes fixed on the driveway where James's car would soon appear, bringing Eric home from the hospital. A soft padding of feet made her turn. Lily stood in the doorway, still in her pajamas, her stuffed unicorn clutched tightly to her chest. "Is Eric coming home today?" she asked, her voice small and hopeful. Sarah nodded, setting down her coffee to swoop Lily into her arms. "Yes, sweetheart. Daddy's bringing him home right now." Lily's face lit up with a smile that made Sarah's heart ache. It had been far too long since she'd seen that unbridled joy on her daughter's face. "Can I make him a welcome home card?" Lily asked eagerly. "That's a wonderful idea," Sarah replied, setting Lily down and reaching for the art supplies they kept in a kitchen drawer. As Lily settled at the table with paper and crayons, Sarah felt a mix of hope and apprehension swirling in her chest. The sound of a car pulling into the driveway made them both look up. Sarah took a deep breath, steadying herself. "They're here," she said, as much to herself as to Lily. They met James and Eric at the door. Eric looked pale and tired, a butterfly bandage still adorning his forehead, but his eyes were clear as they met Sarah's. "Welcome home," Sarah said softly, fighting the urge to pull him into a hug. They weren't there yet, she reminded herself, baby steps. But it was Lily who broke the tension, barreling past Sarah to throw her arms around Eric's waist. "Eric, I made you a card." Eric winced slightly at the impact, but managed a genuine smile as he ruffled Lily's hair. "Thanks, Quirt. I can't wait to see it." As they made their way into the living room, Sarah caught Jane's eye. The relief and cautious hope she saw there mirrored her own feelings. This was their chance to make things right, but the road ahead wouldn't be easy. The next few days were a delicate dance of rediscovering each other. Eric was still recovering, spending most of his time resting, which gave them all space to adjust to being under the same roof again. Sarah found herself hyper-aware of every interaction, every word spoken, desperate not to misstep and jeopardize his fragile peace they'd found. It was on Eric's third day home that Sarah decided to take a risk. She knocked gently on his bedroom door, a tray of soup and sandwiches in her hands. "Come in," Eric called. Sarah entered, setting the tray on his bedside table. "I thought you might be hungry," she said, hovering uncertainly. Eric nodded, sitting up slowly. "Thanks," he said, reaching for a sandwich. Sarah perched on the edge of the bed, her heart racing. "Eric, I was wondering if we could talk." Eric stilled, his sandwich halfway to his mouth. For a moment, Sarah feared he would refuse, but then he nodded, setting the food back down. "Okay." Sarah took a deep breath. "I owe you an apology," she began. "What I did, suggesting that you go to your grandparents, it was wrong. I was scared and overwhelmed, and instead of trying to understand what you were going through, I took the easy way out. I'm so sorry." Eric was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on his hands. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I was so angry. I felt like you were trying to get rid of me, like I didn't fit into your perfect new family." Sarah felt tears pricking at her eyes. "Oh, Eric, That was never true. You are a part of this family, an important part. We all got lost somewhere along the way. Eric looked up then, his eyes shining with unshed tears. I didn't make it easy, he admitted. I was awful to you, to Dad, even to Lily sometimes. You were hurting, Sarah said gently. We all were. But that's in the past now. What matters is where we go from here. Eric nodded slowly. I want to try, he said. To make this work, I mean. I'm not sure how. Sarah reached out hesitantly, placing her hand over Eric's. When he didn't pull away, she felt a spark of hope ignite in her chest. We'll figure it out together, she promised. All of us. That conversation marked a turning point. It wasn't an instant fix. There were still moments of tension, of old hurts bubbling to the surface. But it was a start, a foundation on which they could begin to rebuild. The family therapy sessions with Dr. Chen became a weekly fixture. At first, they were awkward and stilted, with long silences and carefully measured words. But as the weeks went by, they began to open up, to peel back the layers of hurt and misunderstanding that had driven them apart. In one particularly emotional session, James broke down as he tried to explain the impossible position he felt caught in, torn between his son and his new wife and daughter. I felt like I was failing all of you, he admitted, his voice choked with tears. I thought if I just tried harder, worked more, I could somehow make everything okay. But I was just running away from the problems. Eric, in a moment that took everyone by surprise, reached out and gripped his father's hand. I get it, Dad, he said softly. I was running too. It was moments like these, small but significant, that began to knit their family back together. Each honest conversation, each vulnerability shared, was another stitch in the fabric of their relationships. Sarah, too, found herself confronting hard truths. In a private session with Dr. Chen, she finally voiced the fear that had been lurking in the back of her mind for months. What if I'm just not cut out to be a stepmother? She asked, her voice trembling. What if I can never love Eric the way I love Lily? Dr. Chen's response was gentle but firm. Sarah, blended families are complex. It's not about loving everyone the same way or trying to replace Eric's mother. It's about creating a new kind of relationship, one built on mutual respect and understanding. Love can grow in many different forms. Those words stayed with Sarah, guiding her as she navigated her relationship with Eric. She stopped trying to force a mother-son bond and instead focused on getting to know Eric as a person, his interests, his dreams, his fears. One Saturday afternoon, she found Eric in the garage, tinkering with an old radio he'd found at a yard sale. Instead of just passing by with a polite hello, as she might have done before, she paused. What are you working on? She asked, genuinely curious. Eric looked up, surprise flickering across his face, before he launched into an explanation of his project. Sarah didn't understand half of what he was saying, but she listened intently, asking questions and marveling at his enthusiasm. As Eric talked, his eyes lit up in a way Sarah had rarely seen before. She realized with a pang that she had never really taken the time to discover this side of him, too caught up in her own anxieties and expectations. That sounds fascinating, she said when he finished. You know, there's an electronics club at the community center. If you're interested, we could look into it together. The smile Eric gave her in response was small but genuine, and Sarah felt something warm unfurl in her chest. It wasn't the instant connection she had once hoped for, but it was real and it was theirs. As the weeks turned into months, the Morrison household found a new rhythm. It wasn't perfect. There were still arguments and misunderstandings, moments of frustration and doubt, but underneath it all was a current of determination, a shared commitment to making their family work. Lily flourished in the more stable environment, her sunny personality reasserting itself. She became a bridge between Eric and his parents, her unconditional love for all of them, often smoothing over rough patches before they could escalate. James learned to balance his work and family life better, making a point to be present for family dinners and weekend activities. He and Eric started a tradition of Saturday morning bike rides, using the time to reconnect and rebuild their bond. Sarah found unexpected joy in the small moments, helping Eric with his college applications, cheering him on at soccer games, even mediating the occasional squabble between him and Lily. She discovered that while her love for Eric was different from her love for Lily, it was no less deep or meaningful. It was a crisp fall evening, almost a year to the day since Eric's accident, when Sarah realized how far they'd come. The family was gathered in the living room, a fire crackling in the fireplace, the remains of a take-out dinner scattered on the coffee table. Eric and Lily were engaged in a heated but good-natured debate over a board game, while James looked on, amusement dancing in his eyes. As Sarah curled up on the couch, a mug of tea warming her hands, she felt a profound sense of contentment wash over her. This, she realized, was what she had always wanted, not a perfect family, but a real one. One that had been tested and bent, but not broken, one that had learned to weather storms together. The bridges they had once burned had been rebuilt, stronger and more flexible than before. They were no longer a fractured collection of individuals trying to fit into prescribed roles, but a true family united by love, understanding, and the shared experience of overcoming adversity. As Eric caught her eye and flashed her a quick smile before turning back to his game with Lily, Sarah felt her heart swell. They still had challenges ahead, she knew. Eric would be leaving for college soon, bringing a whole new set of adjustments. But for the first time, Sarah felt truly confident that they could handle whatever came their way. They had learned the most valuable lesson of all. That family wasn't about perfection or meeting some idealized standard. It was about showing up, day after day, with open hearts and minds. It was about forgiveness, patience, and the willingness to keep trying even when things got tough. As the evening wore on and the fire burned low, Sarah looked around at her family, her husband, her daughter, her stepson who had become so much more than that label could encompass, and felt a deep sense of gratitude. They had been given a second chance, and they had made the most of it. The trust they had rebuilt was precious and hard-won, a testament to their collective strength and resilience. It wasn't always easy, and there would undoubtedly be more challenges ahead. But Sarah knew now, with unshakable certainty, that they would face those challenges together as a family. As Lily's laughter rang out and James pulled Sarah close, planting a kiss on her temple, Sarah closed her eyes and savored the moment. They had weathered the storm and emerged stronger for it. The bridges they had built would carry them forward into whatever the future might hold. A new foundation. The late summer sun cast a golden glow over the Morrison household as Sarah stood in Eric's doorway, watching him pack for college. A bittersweet mixture of pride and sadness welled up inside her as she observed the young man he'd become. It seemed like only yesterday that they were navigating the treacherous waters of their newly blended family, and now here they were, preparing to send Eric off into the world. "Need any help?" Sarah offered, stepping into the room. Eric looked up from the suitcase he was stuffing with clothes. "Sure," he said with a small smile. "I can't seem to fit everything." As Sarah began folding shirts with practiced efficiency, she marveled at how far they'd come. The tension that had once filled the air between them had been replaced by a comfortable camaraderie. It hadn't been an easy journey, but every step had been worth it. "You know," Eric said, breaking the companionable silence, "I never thought we'd be here." Sarah paused in her folding. "What do you mean?" Eric sat on the edge of his bed, his expression thoughtful. "A year ago, I couldn't wait to leave this house. Now, I'm actually going to miss it. Miss all of you." Sarah felt her heart swell with emotion. She sat down next to Eric, careful to give him space. "We're going to miss you too, so much. But Eric, I want you to know how proud we are of you. How proud I am of you." Eric's eyes met hers, a mix of vulnerability and gratitude in his gaze. "Thanks, Sarah, for everything. I know I didn't make it easy at first." Sarah chuckled softly. "None of us did, but that's family, isn't it? It's not about being perfect. It's about growing together, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard. As they resumed packing, Sarah reflected on the past year. There had been ups and downs, moments of doubt and moments of triumph, but through it all they had stuck together, committed to building something stronger than what they had before. Downstairs, the sound of the front door opening announced James' return from work. Moments later, Lily's excited voice echoed through the house. "Dad, did you get the streamers for Eric's party?" Sarah and Eric exchanged an amused glance. Lily had been planning a surprise, see-you-later party. She refused to call it a goodbye party. For Eric for weeks, her enthusiasm infectious. As they headed downstairs to greet James and Lily, Sarah was struck by how natural it felt, the four of them together. The awkwardness that had once permeated their interactions had given way to a genuine warmth and understanding. The next few days were a whirlwind of activity. Friends and family came and went, offering congratulations and advice to Eric. Sarah found herself in the kitchen more often than not, preparing Eric's favorite meals and baking cookies for him to take to college. It was during one of these baking sessions that Lily approached her, a serious expression on her young face. "Mom," she said, climbing onto a stool at the kitchen island, "is Eric going to forget about us when he goes to college?" Sarah set down the mixing bowl she was holding, giving Lily her full attention. "Oh, sweetheart, no. Eric loves us, and distance won't change that. He'll be busy with school and making new friends, but he'll always be a part of our family." Lily nodded, seeming to mull this over. "Can we visit him?" "Of course," Sarah assured her. "And he'll come home for holidays and breaks. Plus, we can video chat with him anytime." Lily's face brightened at this. "Maybe we can have family game nights over video." Sarah laughed, ruffling Lily's hair. "That's a wonderful idea. Why don't you go tell Eric about it?" As Lily scampered off to find her brother, Sarah felt a wave of gratitude wash over her. Despite all the challenges they faced, Lily's love for Eric had never wavered. In many ways, her unwavering acceptance had been the glue that held them together during the darkest times. The night before Eric was set to leave, the family gathered in the living room for one last movie night. As they settled in, Sarah couldn't help but remember a similar night over a year ago, when the tension had been so thick you could cut it with a knife. The contrast to now was stark. James and Eric were debating the merits of various superhero films, their banter easy and affectionate. Lily was curled up between them, interjecting her own opinions with the confidence of a child who knows she's loved and valued. As Sarah brought in a bowl of popcorn, she caught James' eye. The love and contentment she saw there mirrored her own feelings. They had weathered the storm together and come out stronger on the other side. The movie started, but Sarah found herself only half watching. Instead, she was memorizing this moment, etching it into her heart. The sound of Lily's giggles, the warmth of James's arm around her shoulders, the sight of Eric, relaxed and happy, in the home he had once been so eager to leave. As the credits rolled, Eric stretched and yawned. "I should probably get some sleep. Big day tomorrow." The mood in the room shifted, the reality of Eric's impending departure settling over them. Lily was the first to move, throwing her arms around Eric's waist. "I'm going to miss you, big brother," she said, her voice muffled against his shirt. Eric hugged her back tightly. "I'll miss you too, squirt. But hey, we've got those video game nights to look forward to, right?" Lily nodded, stepping back and wiping her eyes. James was next, pulling Eric into a bear hug. "I'm so proud of you, son," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "You're going to do great things." When it was Sarah's turn, she found herself hesitating. But Eric surprised her by initiating the hug, wrapping his arms around her in a warm embrace. "Thank you," he whispered, so quietly that only she could hear. "For not giving up on me, on us." Sarah felt tears pricking at her eyes as she hugged him back. "Never," she promised. "We're family, always." The next morning dawned bright and clear. As they loaded Eric's belongings into the car, Sarah was struck by a sense of déjà vu. Hadn't they done this before, when Eric had left for his grandparents? But this time was different. This time, there was no anger, no resentment, just love, pride, and yes, a little sadness. As they stood in the driveway, ready for the final goodbyes, Sarah looked at the faces of her family. James, trying to be strong but unable to hide the sheen of tears in his eyes. Lily, clutching the care package she had insisted on making for Eric, and Eric himself, looking both excited and a little scared, on the brink of this new adventure. "You've got this," Sarah said, giving Eric one last hug. "And remember, we're always here for you. Always." As they watched Eric drive away, Lily tucked between them, Sarah felt James squeeze her hand. She looked up at him, seeing in his eyes the same mix of emotions she was feeling. "We did it," he said softly. "We really did it." And they had. They had taken a fractured, hurting family and built something beautiful, something real. It wasn't perfect, no family ever is, but it was strong, resilient, built on a foundation of love, understanding, and the willingness to keep trying, no matter what. As they turned to go back into the house, Sarah paused for a moment, looking at the home they had created together. It wasn't just a building anymore. It was a symbol of everything they had overcome, everything they had built. The bridges they had once burned had been rebuilt, stronger than ever. And on that foundation, they had created something precious and unbreakable, a true family. Sarah knew there would be challenges ahead. Eric would face ups and downs in college. Lily would enter her teenage years. She and James would continue to navigate the complexities of marriage and parenthood. But she also knew, with a certainty that ran bone deep, that they could handle whatever came their way. Because they had learned the most important lesson of all, that love, real love, isn't about perfection. It's about showing up day after day. It's about forgiveness, patience, and the courage to be vulnerable. It's about building bridges, even when it seems impossible. As Sarah closed the front door behind them, she felt a sense of peace settle over her. They had weathered the storm and emerged stronger for it. Whatever the future held, they would face it together as a family. The bridges they had built would carry them forward into new adventures, new challenges, and new joys. And Sarah knew, without a doubt, that those bridges would stand the test of time. In the quiet of the house, with Lily's hand in hers and James' arm around her shoulders, Sarah smiled. This was their new foundation, built on the ashes of what came before, stronger and more beautiful than she could have ever imagined. And it was more than enough. It was everything.